The morning sun hung low over the plains, soft and pale, when the stagecoach stopped before the broken wooden fence of the Carson Ranch. The air smelled of dust and dying grass, the kind that clings to old dreams. From the coach stepped a woman, broad-shouldered, tired-eyed, and heavier than most who came this far west. Her black dress clung awkwardly in the dry wind, and her gloved hands trembled as she lifted her travel bag to the dirt. She did not look around for anyone to greet her. "She knew none would? You're the widow?" came a voice from behind the fence, slow and low like gravel sliding. It was Silas Carson, the ranch owner. A tall man with sunburned skin, hat brim low, and the kind of silence that said he'd seen more graves than weddings. "Mrs. Mayfield?" she answered, her voice soft but steady. "I came to work, sir. I can cook, mend, keep house. I'm not here for charity." He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted over her. A widow not young, not graceful, and not the kind men spoke softly to. But her face held something that Silas recognized, pride buried under ruin. The same look his own reflection had carried since the fire that took half his cattle and all his luck. "Work starts early," he finally said. "Cook's hut is behind the barn. If you're still standing by sundown, you can stay another night." She nodded. No smile, no gratitude, only resolve. She picked up her bag and walked toward the hut without waiting for permission. She had done this before. New town, new man in charge, same look of doubt. She had learned that words couldn't fix what people already thought of her. Inside the small kitchen shack, she set down her things and looked at the chipped pot, the rusted stove, and the empty shelves. Her fingers brushed the counter, feeling the grit of neglect. "A mess," she whispered to herself, but a fixable one. Her late husband had left her little but debt and shame. He'd drunk through her savings and ruined her good name before dying in a gunfight that wasn't even his own. She'd buried him without tears. Since then, she'd traveled west under the weight of whispers. "No one marries a fat widow, ma'am. Best you find work." Outside, the ranch creaked and stirred to life. Silas gave orders to 2 ranch hands, boys no older than 19, rough but loyal. They eyed the new woman curiously, one snickering under his breath until Silas's cold stare silenced him. "You need something cooked. Don't mock the hands that make it," Silas muttered. By noon, the smell of stew floated through the ranch, rich, spiced, and warm. The men who came in from the fields paused, surprised. No one had cooked like that since Silas's late wife, and that had been 3 winters ago. Silas entered last, his hat in his hands. "Smells decent," he said. The widow turned from the stove. "Smells like survival," she replied. "Eat before it cools." The words hung heavy in the air. No softness, no flirtation, only honesty. She served them, silent and steady, her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping from her bun. When she finally sat down, she did not join their talk. She simply ate, eyes low, as if daring the food itself to prove her worth. After supper, Silas lingered by the door. "You cook like someone who's buried a dream or two," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "And you talk like someone who's still digging the grave." For the first time that day, something shifted in his face. Maybe surprise, maybe respect. "You're not afraid to speak plain," he said. "Words are cheaper than bread," she murmured, turning back to the dishes. "But both can fill a man if used right." He almost smiled then, but didn't. Outside, the wind carried the sound of coyotes. The sky was bleeding orange into purple, and the widow scrubbed the last plate as if erasing her past from its surface. Silas watched her a moment longer, then stepped out into the fading light. That night, when she lay on the thin cot in the cook's hut, she listened to the distant whinny of horses and the faint hum of men talking by the barn. She pulled her blanket tight and whispered into the dark, "I came to work. That's all." But her voice cracked on the last word, and for a brief moment she hated the silence that followed. Across the yard, Silas sat on the porch, staring into the dark. He thought about the widow's hands, steady, unflinching, the kind that had known both labor and loss. Something in him stirred, something he thought long buried beside his wife's grave. He shook his head and whispered, "Don't be a fool, Silas. She ain't here for you." But as the wind rustled the dry grass, he found himself listening for her footsteps again. The next morning would bring dust, gossip, and a new kind of trouble, the kind that starts quiet, like a spark in dry hay, before it burns through everything it touches. The next morning came with frost on the troughs and smoke in the air. Dawn broke quiet over the Carson Ranch, but not peaceful. Something in the wind felt sharp, like it carried words yet unspoken. The widow Mayfield was already awake before the roosters. Her fingers were raw from scrubbing pots, her shoulders aching from lifting water. Yet she didn't slow. She had worked her whole life to keep herself useful, because usefulness was safer than being pitied. Silas found her outside, kneeling by the well, her hair loose from its pins, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You don't have to start before light," he said. "Light doesn't pay wages," she replied without looking up. He almost said something more, but stopped. She wasn't one for kindness, and neither was he. They understood each other best through silence. Later that morning, 2 riders arrived from town, traders bringing supplies and gossip. One of them, a lean man with a grin too wide, caught sight of the widow hanging laundry by the barn. "Who's the new cook?" he called. Silas didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. "Heard you took in a widow," the man pressed, spitting into the dirt. "She looks sturdy enough to carry a cow. Maybe she'll outwork your men." The ranch hands chuckled until Silas's eyes cut through them. "She's worth more than your jokes," he said quietly. "And she's working harder than any man here." "Let her be." The trader blinked, surprised by the tone. No one had heard Silas defend anyone since his wife died. The widow overheard the exchange from where she stood. She didn't turn around, but her hands stopped shaking the sheet for a long, trembling moment. No one had defended her in years, not since before the world started calling her fat widow like it was a title, not a wound. By noon, Silas found her again, this time mending a saddle strap on the porch. "You heard me, didn't you?" he asked. She didn't look up. "I hear most things, sir." "Then you know I meant it." She finally looked at him. "You didn't have to." "Maybe not," he said, shifting his weight. "But you earned it." For the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled, small and quiet, the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything in return. It faded as quick as it came. "People don't speak for me much," she said softly. "Maybe they should start," he replied. The day passed under the heavy rhythm of chores. As the sun dropped low, painting the fields in gold and shadow, Silas walked down to the river bend where the cattle drank. He thought of her, how her voice carried the same strength as his mother's once had, how her eyes looked tired yet stubborn, how she never begged for sympathy. He didn't know what he was feeling, only that it scared him. Back at the ranch, the widow sat alone by the kitchen window, candlelight flickering on her face. She could still hear his words. "She's worth more than your jokes." She repeated them under her breath, testing how they sounded against her heart. They felt strange. They felt dangerous, because kind words had always come with a price. The night deepened. Outside, the coyotes cried again. Silas passed the window on his way to the stables, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass, his shadowed by the hat brim, hers glimmering with something unspoken. Neither said a word. But in that stillness, something began to shift, slow and quiet as thawing ice. Neither of them knew it yet. But by the time the next storm rolled through, their names would be tied together by more than work, and the silence between them would become the most dangerous thing on the ranch. 3 days later, the sky turned strange. The horizon darkened with a line of clouds that moved faster than a galloping horse. The air thickened, heavy and cold, pressing down on the Carson Ranch like a warning. By mid-afternoon, the wind came screaming through the valley, lifting dust, shaking the barn doors, and sending the cattle into restless panic. The widow Mayfield stood by the kitchen window, wiping her hands on her apron. "Storm's coming hard," she murmured. Silas appeared in the doorway, pulling on his coat. "Yeah, wind's out of the north. It'll hit before sundown." She turned to him, worry creasing her brow. "The herd's still out by the creek." "I'll bring 'em in," he said, reaching for his hat. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "You'll need help." He looked at her, the flicker of lightning reflecting in his eyes. That's men's work, ma'am. Then you're one man short, she said, grabbing her shawl before he could argue. Minutes later, they were out in the storm, rain slashing sideways, thunder rolling low across the plains. The widow fought against the wind, her dress soaked and heavy, her hair whipping free. Silas shouted for the cattle, cracking his whip, driving them toward the corral. She moved beside him, fearless, waving a lantern through the dark. A sudden flash of lightning spooked the herd. One steer bolted, crashing through the fence, nearly trampling her. Silas caught her arm and yanked her aside, both falling hard into the mud. For a long second, neither spoke, only breathing in the roar of rain and thunder. "You're mad, woman," he said, voice rough. "You're welcome," she answered, gasping for air, her face streaked with rain and grit. Together they worked until their hands bled and their boots filled with water. By the time the last cow was penned, night had fallen thick and wild. They stumbled into the barn, shivering, drenched, and exhausted. Silas lit a small lamp. The golden light cast long shadows on the hay-strewn floor. "You could have been killed," he said quietly. "So could you," she replied, pulling her wet shawl tighter. "Difference is, I had reason to stay close. You'd have lost the whole herd." Silas stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You don't give up easy, do you?" "Not much left to give up," she said softly. "Work's all I got, sir." Something in her tone cut through him deeper than the wind ever could. He stepped closer, his voice lower now. "You keep saying that, sir, like you owe me something." "You don't. You've done more for this ranch than anyone since my wife." She froze. The word wife hung in the air like a ghost. Silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain hammering the roof. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to take her place." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't. But maybe you reminded me what it feels like to have someone fight beside me again." She looked up then, eyes wide, uncertain. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I never have," he said, voice low, steady. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold. She turned away, gripping the edge of the workbench. "You should rest," she said quietly. "Storm's not done." He didn't argue. Instead, he picked up a blanket and draped it over her shoulders before leaving the barn. She stood there long after he was gone, her heart pounding like thunder, for the first time in years. She didn't feel invisible. Outside, the storm rolled on, fierce and unrelenting, but somewhere in its noise, something tender had begun to take root, fragile as spring grass breaking through the frost. The storm left the land bruised and quiet. Fences were torn, trees split, and the air smelled of wet earth and ash. When morning came, mist rolled low over the valley, and the ranch looked softer somehow, like the world had paused to breathe. The widow Mayfield rose early, her body sore, but her spirit restless. She moved through the kitchen, tending to breakfast, the rhythm of work calming her thoughts. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Silas's face in the lightning, the way he'd looked at her in the barn, the way his voice had softened when he'd said her name. When he entered the kitchen that morning, his boots left a trail of mud and his hat dripped water onto the floor. He nodded once, quiet as always. "You did good last night," he said. She poured his coffee, eyes low. We both did. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the clinking of cutlery and the low crackle of the stove. Then Silas said, "I've been thinking. You shouldn't be doing all this alone. The ranch hands'll help more from now on." She frowned. "I don't need their help." "It ain't about need," he said softly. "It's about fairness." "Fairness?" she echoed, almost laughing. "The world's never been fair to a widow, sir. Not one shaped like me." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe it's time someone changed that." Her hand froze mid-air. Something in his tone, firm, certain, made her chest ache. She wanted to believe him, but she'd lived too long on other people's promises. "Words don't fix much out here," she said finally. He nodded. "No, actions do." That afternoon, when the traders from town returned to check on the damage, the same man who'd mocked her before made another cruel remark, louder this time. "Didn't know you'd hired yourself a woman with a blacksmith's shoulders, Carson. She cook or carry your plow horses, too." Before the laughter could rise, Silas stepped forward, his hand landing hard on the man's chest. "You best leave," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "And don't ride back." The trader's grin faltered. "Was only joking." "So am I," Silas said. But there was nothing light in his eyes. The men left without another word. The widow stood in the doorway, breath caught in her throat. When Silas turned toward her, she said quietly, "You shouldn't have done that. Folks'll talk." "Let 'em," he said. "They always do." For the first time, she didn't look away. The wind lifted her hair and she met his gaze head-on. "Why?" she asked. "Why defend me like that?" Silas's voice softened. "Because no one ever did that for my wife when she was judged. And because you deserve better than their cruelty." She felt her throat tighten. "You don't even know me." "Maybe I'm starting to," he said. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of rain and sagebrush, and somewhere a hawk cried over the hills. Silas stepped closer, his boots crunching the dry earth. "I don't care what they call you, Mrs. Mayfield," he said quietly. "Widow, worker, whatever name they throw, you've done more for this place than anyone else since I lost her." "I see it," she swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "You shouldn't say such things." "Maybe I should have said them sooner," he replied. She turned away, blinking fast, trying to steady herself. "You're kind, sir, but I ain't looking for pity." "And I ain't giving it," he said. "Just the truth." The silence that followed was deep and trembling. Somewhere beyond the corral, the clouds began to clear, sunlight breaking through the gray. She lifted her face toward the light, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt warmth that didn't come from the stove. Something had shifted between them. Something fragile and dangerous, like glass catching firelight. She didn't dare name it yet, but she knew it had already taken root. And Silas, standing behind her with his hat in his hands, knew that no storm, no gossip, no ghost of the past could quite scare him the same way she now did. The summer dust came early that year. By June, the grass was brittle, the sun harsh, and the Carson Ranch stretched dry and quiet beneath a pale, endless sky. Yet inside that silence, something new had grown, slow, steady, and fragile as spring water. The widow Mayfield no longer kept her eyes on the ground when Silas passed, and Silas, though still quiet as the hills, found himself lingering near the kitchen door just to hear her hum while she worked. The men noticed first. Whispers spread across the ranch like wildfire. "The boss has taken a shine to the widow," they said. Some spoke kindly, others with cruel laughter. But neither Silas nor the widow paid them much mind. Both had lived through worse kinds of talk. One evening, after a long day repairing the corral, Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, her apron folded neatly in her lap. The sky above was awash of pink and gold, and the air carried the faint scent of rain far away. He sat beside her without a word. For a long while they listened to the cicadas. Then she said softly, "Folks have been talking, you know." "Folks always talk," he replied. "They say I'm after comfort." "That I'm trying to take what ain't mine." He turned his head toward her. "And are you?" Her lips trembled into a faint smile. "No, sir. I came to work. Not to dream." Silas looked down at his hands, scarred, sunburned, honest hands that had built and buried more than most men ever would. "Maybe," he said quietly, "dreaming ain't such a bad thing." "Not if it's with someone who's earned it," she laughed once, low and bitter. "You don't mean that?" He met her eyes. "I don't say what I don't mean." The air thickened between them. She turned away, staring out toward the fields. "You don't understand, Silas. Men don't look at women like me and see something to love. They see work or pity or shame. I've heard it all, like no one marries a fat widow, they say." "She's better suited to the kitchen than the altar." Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked down, ashamed of the tears that came. Silas let the silence settle before he spoke, his voice deep, steady, and gentle as the evening wind. "You're right," he said. "No one marries a fat widow." She stiffened, her hands curling in her lap, but before she could rise, he added softly, "No one marries her because most men are fools." She blinked, the words catching her off guard. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They don't see what I see. A woman who keeps this place alive when I near gave up on it. A woman who ain't afraid of storms or hard work or truth. I don't care what the world calls you, Mayfield. I see you, her breath hitched. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? He asked. Because it'll break me if you don't mean them. Silas turned then, his gaze steady, his voice barely above a whisper. Then let me break the silence instead. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch and the distant lowing of cattle. Then he said it, the words that would live in her heart forever. No one marries a fat widow, you said, he murmured. Well, maybe no one ever did. But I ain't no one. She stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and hope. Tears slid down her cheeks silently. He reached out, rough fingers brushing hers. You came here to work, he said softly. But what you've done is more than that. You brought life back to this place, and to me. The evening sun sank behind the hills, leaving them wrapped in gold and shadow. She closed her eyes, whispering through trembling lips. You can't mean that. I do, he said simply. And if you'll have me, Mayfield, I'll marry you. Not because you work hard, not because I'm lonely, but because somewhere between the storms and the silence, I fell in love with the woman who thought no one ever could. The words hung in the warm air like a promise. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her hand found his, trembling, sure. You're a fool, Silas Carson, she whispered. He smiled faintly. Maybe, but I'm your fool if you'll let me be. And in that quiet corner of the world, beneath a sky wide enough to hold their sorrow and their hope, the widow who had come only to work finally let herself believe that love could find her too.